Hello and welcome to this video specifically looking at Chinese elm as a species for bonsai. The Chinese elm is your typical bonsai and perhaps one of the most common. It is the most readily available species across most countries. In fact, you could arguably say across the world. It can be typically identified by its twisted trunk, small bright green leaves, and fine structure. The reason for its popularity is very simple. The Chinese elm will take all sorts of punishment. You can overwater it, underwater it, leave it out to bake in sunlight or freeze in the winter, cut off large branches, and it will still keep on going. Admittedly, not as well as some species, but still, it will survive. The Chinese elm has different appearances as it matures. It initially starts out relatively smooth, and as it gets older, the bark will turn into a darker scaly-like appearance with a cracked surface. There will also be parts of it that'll be quite smooth, but these will roughen as it ages. The leaves go from a light, very bright, light, smooth green colour to a darker, almost matte green colour. We've mentioned the hardiness of the elm, and this should come as no surprise since you can find it in parts of Siberia, down through parts of northern China, and even in other parts of the world where it's been introduced as a species. This is why they're indigenous right across Southeast Asia, and commonly found in China. When the tree grows in the wild, it can be up to 25 meters tall. The trunk widths will vary wildly based on where the tree is growing and how, although they can get quite wide. The elm itself has very small leaves, and they're relatively fine in some ways. They have a jagged edge to them looking almost like a saw tooth. The branches on the bonsai form are often quite fine, and they become ramified very easily. This is where you get a lot of growth. The roots themselves are also quite pronounced. When you look at it with all these factors, you can see why it's attractive as a bonsai. You get a nice wide root flare or nabari. The trunk is well proportioned to its overall shape. The trunk itself is interesting, and the leaves themselves create a full dense canopy from all those thin, light branches which give it depth. Further to this, the Chinese elm is considered semi-deciduous. It keeps some of its leaves, and in some cases, all of its leaves over winter. This will vary on your local conditions. This means that it will remain in generally good health year-round and be a sign of life and freshness, so to speak. For those who like to keep their bonsai indoors, this is another reason why the elm is so popular. That growth is also very predictable. It's one reason why it's very beginner friendly. If you're looking at growing a Chinese elm as a bonsai, it has very low maintenance conditions. It wants a very well draining but very rich soil. Combine it with a little bit of sand to help with that drainage, and you can get away with just about anything. One thing you can't get away with is extended periods of drought when it's extremely hot. You want to avoid trying to drown it in water as well. Again, it can make do if you make the occasional mistake, but it can't deal with it constantly. You want to wait until the soil feels dry to touch, and then water it. We've mentioned that the elm is something that grows extremely well, or at least it ramifies extremely well. As with most trees like this, you need to give it a good fertilizer every couple of weeks, or a solid fertilizer at least every 3 to 4 months. Use of things like nitrogen-rich fertilizers at the right time can help to reinforce the benefits of normal fertilizer, but are not necessary. Try to avoid fertilizing the tree at all during winter, as it is dormant at this time and can't make use of that fertilizer. The tree's growing season, so to speak, is from spring through to autumn. That's roughly 9 months of growth, although it will again vary based on your location. You need to be careful not to use a fertilizer when the buds for new leaves first begin to open up. If you do that, the fertilizer can cause damage to them. Most of the time it's advised to use a well-balanced fertilizer, that is one with equal parts of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. If you've done your job with fertilizing and letting the tree grow well, you now need to be concerned about pruning. The elm will develop growth quite quickly, and this growth will come both as new branches and thicker existing branches. These will need to be cut back every year. This is done for several reasons. The most important of these is simply the ramification. You want a dense canopy of leaves on top of your tree and on each branch. This can only be done by cutting it back to the last 2 or 3 nodes. This is often the first or second leaf on the branch. This will then turn into a new branch from that leaf bud. That then becomes the ramification for your continued growth. This may need to be done several times during summer and autumn to encourage growth. Make sure to take it back to that 1 or 2 nodes. And when you're looking at winter, when the tree is dormant, you may also want to consider defoliating the tree at this time. One concern with elm is that it will develop suckers. These are new trees starting to grow out from the base and roots. They should be cut away as soon as they appear. You don't want the tree putting growth into these unless you're going to use them as a sacrifice branch. When looking to repot, make sure to prune a lot of growth from the tree about a month before this happens, although we'll describe more detail on repotting shortly. Chinese elm will need to be wired if you're looking for a specific form that follows the general guides for this form. When doing this, you want to wait until the branches begin to harden off. This means they may be a year or so old by the time you can wire them. If you try to wire them while they're still fresh and green in colour, they're often too fragile and will snap. The Chinese elm itself is generally considered suitable for just about every style. Your Chinese elm will cope with a lot of punishment, as we've mentioned, but despite this you should still take some care in how you position it. One of the big issues is that despite how reliable it can be and how hardy it is, you do want to avoid it getting too hot or too cold. In fact, in some cases, if it gets too cold, you can cause damage to the buds. At the same time, you do need to bring it down below 10 degrees Celsius. This is what triggers the tree to enter dormancy. If your Chinese elm does not enter dormancy, those leaf buds may not be activated to open up come spring. This temperature is also not cold enough to damage the tree in any significant way. If the temperature is too high, you may find that you have issues of the water simply comes out of the pot too quickly and you can't keep up with it. So a slightly protected environmental position is ideal. Repotting your bonsai is surprisingly easy. You start, as we mentioned, by removing as much of the growth as you can that you no longer want about a month before. This will often be in late winter. You then need to wait until the buds of the tree start to swell. This is just before the buds of the tree pop open and the leaves start growing. You want to do it at this point because once you repot it, your tree needs to be able to take advantage of the new soil and grow as quickly as possible to replace the growth that you've taken off, heal the wounds, and embed itself in the pot properly with new roots. Do this in late winter or early spring. It will depend rather on your tree. Try to plant it into a pot of the same size or only slightly larger. When repotting, avoid taking too much of the root ball off, maybe a fifth in most cases. This is why you have to pot into a slightly larger pot each time. Newly trained or young Chinese elm will require repotting every 2 years. The older the tree gets, the further the space between these repottings will be. Most trees more than 5 to 6 years old will need to be repotted every 3 to 4 years. and this will become a reasonably consistent pattern, extending up to 5 years in time between. There are only a few pests of concern when you look at the Chinese elm, and these are your elm beetles, which are prolific across North America and parts of Europe. There's also issues with the foliage itself. The big concern with most of your bonsai are going to be things like aphids, and this can be done by using something like white oil or a similar spray. Neem oil is another example that's commonly used. As you can see, the elm is an incredibly practical species to begin learning with. It looks extremely good, it grows extremely well, and is fairly beginner friendly. A little bit of care and you can learn a lot from this species, and it'll be very forgiving of any mistakes that you make along the way, and in some cases those mistakes can become features. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.